All right, all right, all right. The final talk discussion for the day is Bitcoin without controversy. I think that's what it is. Yeah.
No, it's not.
We'll see about that. Okay, so I did not prepare any of the co-panelists here today with what the questions are.
No one even told me I would be on a panel, so.
Well, you were told just now, so here you are. But you're all vets. You'll be able to handle it just fine. Let's start with introductions. I think most people already know who these fine gentlemen are, but I think it'll be helpful for the topic to introduce each of yourselves with a little bit of the controversies that have surrounded you. And so the opening question I'm going to start with is, what is the most controversial thing you've been involved in, proposed, or helped develop with? And what is the least controversial thing that you've been involved in that you think should have been more controversial? Ideally, you can answer both of those, or you can pick one. But yeah, let's start with you, Peter.
Well, I have to go clarify the most controversial Bitcoin thing I've been involved in. And bizarrely, that seems to have been like Libre Relay. I mean, if it creates a hat, it has to be controversial.
That's right.
But, you know, maybe something that I managed to go push through that should have been controversial, let me think. Maybe something actually seemingly boring, like setting end lock time on transactions, because it turns out of privacy issues and no one really flagged it. So yeah, you should have pushed back on that.
There you go. Jeremy?
Yeah, so let's see. In terms of most controversial, that would probably be proposing Bitcoin have covenants. And I, originally made that proposal in concrete form in like 2019, and so here we are.
Who doesn't want to secure the bag, though?
I guess many do not want hyperbolic opcodes in Bitcoin, and so for whatever set of reasons that was really controversial. I think the thing I would say on that I'm most surprised about is that like 7 years later, that's still like a main topic of conversation, that like, oh, we could do this one. And I guess that shows that it really is truly very controversial, because it would have been decided yes or no like much faster if it weren't controversial in some way. And then I guess one thing that I was involved in that should have probably been more controversial was with like Taproot activation. I sort of maybe unofficially took the role of like progress whip at some point, and hosted a set of meetings to make it go forward. Personally, at the time, I was kind of like anti-Taproot for some reasons, but I wanted to see progress happen, and most people were like really excited, so I favored like the consensus. But I thought at the time Taproot probably should have been a little bit more controversial, but it was like I wanted to see things move forward. But now it seems like it has become more controversial that it wasn't controversial, which is interesting to see.
I guess in some ways the most controversial is the same as Jeremy's, which is that I just proposed that we do soft forks, and I kind of, when I say things like I just did in my talk just now of, soft forks, chain splits, they're okay. Certain people treat that as though it's blasphemy. So changing Bitcoin is the most controversial thing I've been involved in or tried to do. In terms of things that should have been more controversial, well, I guess it's a different take on Jeremy's. The late changes to Taproot that all sounded really good. In particular, going from 33 to 32 byte, the gigglers here, pub keys. I was supportive of that at the time, although I wasn't a public figure really in Bitcoin yet. And it turns out that late changes to anything Bitcoin related should be looked at with suspicion.
Awesome. So yeah, I think that this is a good segue to one of the first questions I had to present to the panel here. So when Nifty asked me to moderate this, and she told me the topic about Bitcoin without controversy, my first kind of question that came to my own mind was, is that something that we even want? Is having controversy maybe a good thing? Because of like some of those last two examples, like maybe a little bit more controversy could have helped, actually all three of them, like could have helped bring issues to light. And so just thinking maybe we could go through the line again and just talk, maybe just if each one of you could just define what controversy means to you. Like when we say Bitcoin without controversy, like what does it mean to be without controversy? And then is that something that's desirable?
Well, I think there's two very different classes of controversy. One is things where the general public gets involved and one where it doesn't. And, you know, if you have, like, depending on how you've achieved no controversy, this can be very bad or actually kind of good. In one way it can be good is because you just do really solid engineering and everyone figures out the right way to go do something. But that tends to be hard on projects that are actually difficult. But when you kind of involve the general public and it becomes a political thing, depending on what you're talking about, you know, sometimes that's just a giant waste of time, as in people getting really angry about Libra Relay when they're just going to lose and that's that. Other times, it's a really fundamental question about, well, what Bitcoin is. And I'd say the block size debate was an example of public controversy that ultimately was good because it really said, well, what is Bitcoin for? And that is a genuine, non-technical discussion that you can go have because your goals are not necessarily technical. Case in point being, you got systems like Tron, which are just fundamentally centralized and they work fine for the people who use it, and they seem happy with that. And it's hard to go say that's wrong from a technical point of view. They're just making different trade-offs than us.
Yeah, I think that controversy is good. Controversy many times is vigorous debate, which I think produces some of the best outcomes. And I think that where we've maybe in some senses failed is not making the most meaningful places controversial, and instead having controversy over squabbling over less important details. Rather than over the most meaty or difficult to solve problems. We've maybe avoided those and favored easier to pick battles.
I think that, similar to what the other guy said here, the controversy is a critical part of being human. And we wouldn't be building a system that involves humans if there wasn't controversy. But I think the challenge we have in Bitcoin is in selecting who to listen to about what things. And so we have let things become controversial almost for the wrong reasons at times. So there's a challenge there, and I mean I'm guilty of it too. So I'm not throwing stones or anything, but we should be mindful when we engage with people that we are engaging with people where it makes sense to, and not letting a controversy grow by the fact that we're engaging in it when it's not helpful.
Yeah, something that I think was repeated in most of those answers is there's like a certain subjectivity, I think, to the what is worthwhile controversy versus what's not. And one of the things that I think is challenging in an open network and decentralized development experience is okay, how do we decide what should be engaged with? How can we push things forward? If maybe there's not enough public controversy, how do we maybe push that and then disincentivize the less constructive controversy? Or is that even possible? I think people get kind of frustrated with, and again myself included too, in the quality of debate sometimes. But is there a way to get one without the other? How do we tamp that down, or do we just have to grow thicker skin? This is an open question. Yeah.
Clearly government censorship. We need to go form a state committee to decide what topics are allowed to be talked about on Twitter.
Well, if I could actually, that is something that people got frustrated with in the filter debates, right? Is that this debate was shut down on the GitHub PR, right? And there was some censorship. People were claiming censorship there. Is that desirable? Do we need more opportunities for that?
I think it's very desirable in that circumstance, because otherwise a bunch of idiots are just going to clog up your GitHub. And if those idiots want to go somewhere else and go debate things, fine. But of course, this gets down to how there's a mix of public and private going on there. And things like GitHub for particular projects are actually private. And unfortunately, people do have to accept that ultimately, if you really, really believe that Bitcoin Core is doing something wrong, you're going to have to go fork it. And you're going to have to accept that depending on the sort of change you want to make, that's a very easy thing to achieve your goals and a very hard thing. Easy in the case of Libra Relay. You know, I didn't need other people to go run my stuff other than a small handful to make the change I wanted. And on the not side, they were just fundamentally picking a exponentially harder battle because their idea just sucks. And, you know, they can go and like have their separate spaces all they want, but it's just it's constrained by what's possible. Now, you could probably come up with examples of this where the nuance ends up being a little differently, where maybe you're pushing for something that's kind of good, and it's unfortunate that people can easily run code and screw it all up. But generally speaking, in Bitcoin, from an engineering level, we basically just accept, yeah, that's possible, and try to write better code. And fortunately, we can be successful, because if we weren't, this whole Bitcoin thing would just fail.
If I could fork off of that for either of you two. So it's actually interesting, like there's the difference between you're making changes at the mempool layer, which is, as Peter is pointing out, is like you don't actually need that many people to be running your fork for it to have an impact if it's of the right technical goal. But the things that need soft forks, it's much harder. If you fork it, the barriers to entry for success and of persuasion are much higher. Is that something, I don't know, maybe both of you guys could talk about your experience. I know, Jeremy, you tried to do an activation client.
Yeah, so I think that one thing that, there's no like clearly documented process for any of this. So whatever you do, it's the right thing or it's the wrong thing. And maybe that's vacuous, but there's no documented process. So definitionally, nothing is right and nothing is wrong. I think overall, people should probably increase their disagreeableness, but then also increase their willingness to follow the leader. And I think that that's contradictory a little bit, but increasing your disagreeableness can look like saying, okay, somebody tells you their idea, tell them all the reasons that it's bad and come up with something that you think is better. And then the follow the leader side could be like, after a year of like discussion or whatever, just going, okay, well, after this is clearly the line is this going to fuck up Bitcoin for good? Yes or no? No. Okay, let's go with the leader on what seems to be like the best. I think that a little bit more of that is better than what we have right now, which is a lot of just sort of like waffling on issue, which delay is not necessarily in any of our interests, especially maybe covenants are fine to delay for a long time, but there are other issues that we might want to more meaningfully address. And I think that is probably a part of it. I think also, at least within the Bitcoin community at large, people get very maybe cliquey around how they use their like points of control on discourse. And I think that maybe part of that is just like calling that out if you see sort of development or like scientific censorship, and then leading by example of just like participating more and saying what you think in more like well documented ways. But
could you define the getting cliquey and then the scientific censorship and maybe some examples?
I think that I'll just speak from my personal experience, and I guess I'll dox myself on this. But at the time of Taproot sort of coming out of the muck, and this is kind of a funny point with what you mentioned about like late changes are bad, is that I think if you look at the timelines, like Taproot had those late changes in like, was it 2020 or 2021? Yeah, and then merged and then activated later. So CTV hasn't changed since it was released more or less like December 2019, January 2020, which means that like at the point where Taproot was merged or whatever, it was actually younger because it had had changes than CTV was. So that was the thing, and I was advocating for CTV because I just thought, oh, we have version bits, we can have independent upgrades, we can work on things independently, and an advocate for a technology should just be like pushing it and describing it and saying what's good or what what it can do. And so I was doing that, and then I started getting feedback, basically kind of like behind closed doors of like, you are going to ruin Taproot for all of us, and like this is really like bad that you would do this. Please do not do this, and if you do this, we'll like ruin your career. Basically, was like the feedback that I was getting, and I was like, okay, well, like I am not really like funded, so I don't want that to happen. And I'm not like opposed to Taproot, but I'll take it on fiat that this will be bad for Taproot happening. And then as I was thinking more about Taproot, I actually started getting a little bit more confused about like the design trade-offs, and I no longer thought that they were reasonable. And I had a conversation with some other people, and I expressed what my concerns were, and they were like, yeah, like I haven't seen any of these points really addressed. Those are entirely valid points. And here are some other points. And I said, okay, well, I'll draft up a letter detailing these points and some other points. And then I was like, okay, well, am I going to like post this under my name? And then I was like, well, everyone's told me they're going to ruin my career if I hold up Taproot, and I'm working on CTV, and so people are going to view this as, oh, I'm trying to sabotage Taproot to get CTV, which is not my goal. My goal is for Bitcoin to progress. But people have made it not really about the quality of like scientific discourse. They've made it about the reputations and things like that. So then I published the letter anonymously, which was like a huge pain in the ass to do with like the Bitcoin forums at the time. People didn't really like deeply engage with the criticism, which was more or less now where we've arrived with what's at BIP 360, where it's like raw. Like my proposal was just like, oh, we should just do raw tap leaf, tap tree, instead of with the tap tweak. That doesn't make sense to me. And like now we've come back there. So if we'd actually had that open scientific debate, maybe people weren't paying attention because I wasn't doing it under my name, and it carried less weight when it's just like an anonymous, throwing out. And so that is kind of a regret of mine of that. But if you look back at like, well, what are the community clickness and like pressures of like, hey, we're going to like advocate against you ever getting funding, or we're going to, go against anything you propose ever again if you sabotage Taproot. It's like, okay, well, I better get in line and help Taproot and like shut up about my like reservations about the protocol if I think that they're still survivable. And so then I did that. And then, once Taproot was sort of like, merged, which I thought was like my, goal of getting it merged with like release parameters. I was like, okay, now we can look at, CTV, and everyone's like, oh no, we can't because we just had Taproot and it's way far too soon and we can't look at it ever again. I'm like, okay, well, clearly I don't understand what this process is, but it's not a real process. It's just like groups of people who feel like they can do things and people who like are outside of that group. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I want to say like a really key thing about the process is you have to go and build consensus around an idea that it's important enough. And I'm probably the author of the least controversial new feature added to Bitcoin, which is check lock time verify, which was a very easy thing to go push through because it was just so obvious that clearly you're going to need this. Like, I wasn't even really the one who kind of identified it. I was just one of the people who said, well, yeah, obviously you're going to need this. I might as well go and actually go do it, write the 5 lines of code it is or whatever it is, and just do it. And that was a very easy process because it's easy to build the consensus, say, yeah, you need this. Obviously, we're going to need it for channels in some way. And Lightning channels to this day do use it in certain cases, and there's no real replacement for it. And immediately after, we got the relative lock time check sequence verify. And again, the process for that, other than certain technical details, but how exactly it worked in certain cases, was a very easy thing because it's like, yeah, well, we definitely needed absolute, we definitely need relative. All right, let's just go push it through and we'll call it done. And I think the problem there is that example is hard to replicate because then you get things like check template verify, which is like, well, do we really need it? I mean, what percentage of use cases is going to actually do this? Clearly with Lightning, we expect basically everyone to go use Lightning in some way, and at the time we didn't call it Lightning, it was some kind of payment channel. Yeah, template verify, it's just not so clear, and quickly it goes down the weeds. Whereas let's say Taproot, yeah, maybe certain technical choices you can push one way or the other, But the idea that you have some kind of Merkleized script thing is just so obvious. Clearly, you're going to need this. Maybe there's slight differences in how, but like it's such an easy thing to get through. And yeah, maybe we should have done 33 bytes instead of 32, but clearly you're going to need something like this to just get out the door.
So just a fun fact is I think roughly 1/3 of value in Taproot addresses is like publicly documented as using CTV emulation. So like I just don't think that we can centrally plan our way to, well, clearly people are going to need this or not, because like
yeah, but I mean, had
things.
you designed like Bitcoin from scratch, you would have gone to Merkleized scripts. That's just how you would have done it. I mean, it's such a clear thing. Now,
but Taproot's also the tweak. So if it's also the tweak, you wouldn't have designed the tweak.
Hang on a second. I'm saying, clearly you would do that. Now, it's a little like, since you have Taproot, it's not so clear that people are immediately going to start using it. And there's a massive upgrade time it takes with wallets, because wallets is dangerous code. No one wants to be the guy who screws up $500 million and loses it to some bug. Like I've been in the position of auditing that code, and it really fucking sucks. And if I remember correctly, last time I did that, Taproot was an option. And my professional advice was, yeah, don't bother with it. Like, let's just keep this thing that currently works. So, how much value is in one or the other, I don't think is a really good argument here. But you can make the really good argument. Certainly, if we went back in time to 2009, you'd say, yeah, obviously Merkleize this.
But I think you'd also, if you were designing Bitcoin from scratch, you'd obviously give people a way to check transaction hashes with or without a signature. The fact that it doesn't have that is an accident of Satoshi using off-the-shelf stuff and then adding op-do Bitcoin in the form of checksig that did multiple operations in one, and that's merely an artifact of kind of accidents of Satoshi as opposed to an intentional design.
I actually disagree with that, because the sort of constructs you do with that really get into the weeds of exactly what the hell you're really doing. I mean, it's just so much simpler to conceive of, yeah, we're going to have scripts. Well, why would you have to reveal all the script? Why not put it under Merkle tree versus, well, there's all these kind of next level things you can go do with it, which are hard to go talk about. Even channels is just barely within the realm of, yeah, it's kind of obvious. I mean, I'd actually make the argument, Merkleizing scripts is more obvious in 2009, in a sense, than the idea of channels.
Well, okay. Well, let's have some more controversy up here. If you look at things that Satoshi talked about and were talked about early in Bitcoin, people did talk about kind of chains of transactions, essentially predefined chains of transactions. And that's exactly what some kind of hash across the next transaction allows you to do, is chaining transactions. At the time, of course, because of what Bitcoin did, they were talking about chaining using pre-signatures. And so it's a weird thing, I guess, where the conversation happened in the context of signatures existing and being the only way to access a hash of a transaction. But that same conversation would have happened with hashes of transactions if it had been possible at the time without the signatures.
Yeah. Well, I think also another reason that it's not so clear is that not that we'll take Ethereum's design as any sort of gospel, but they obviously designed after Bitcoin and designed with an idea of like, okay, we're going to improve a lot, and like Merkleized script is not a part of Solidity. It's something you could like theoretically do some Merkleization within your program itself, but like the actual scripts aren't Merkleized.
I wouldn't make that argument, because I'd say Ethereum's design was not about making a system that had good smart contracts. It was about making a system that was very easy for dumb programmers to think they could do something interesting by presenting them an interface that kind of looks like normal programming, which we know, and we knew at the time when Ethereum was made, that's clearly not how you do it. I mean, that's just such a bad model to go work in. State machines are the right model. And Ethereum threw that advice out because they weren't trying to go create a good system. They're trying to go create a system that could lead to a big pump and dump.
But if you're saying state machines are the right model, then that's precisely not talking about Merkleization and precisely talking about covenants, which are an attempt at doing state machines inside of Bitcoin.
Right, because in a state machine, you're going to want to have state transitions that are authorized transitions and state transitions that are no authorization transitions, right? That's one of the fundamental aspects of a state machine in this system.
We're going to pull away from implementation details here, because those are fun conversations for at the bar. Right? We all love having those conversations at the bar. But to bring it back to the topic of Bitcoin without controversy, I think one of the interesting things that you were describing there, Peter, is I think that there's this idea of like, how do you measure controversy? And I think one of the things that you highlight, like SegWit and Taproot certainly weren't. Taproot was less controversial than SegWit, but turned out to have more controversial things after the fact in terms of like its activation. There was like very little controversy about the activation itself. Check lock time and check sequence verify, very little controversy, but also the community of developers was much, much smaller. I remember having conversations with colleagues at the time of the block size wars, and this one colleague happened to be very into Ethereum, and I remember his comment stuck out to me so much because he's like, you Bitcoiners, like you have all these fights about stupid things, but we in Ethereum, we've actually solved this already. And I was like, no, your community is just a bunch of friends that are working on a project together at this point in time. You will have controversy. And so I think there's this element of like, and I've seen this around a lot of the software, it's like, well, this project or this proposal has too much controversy, therefore, and we need more consensus before we merge it in. But at the end of the day, it's like, what is the level, like how are we going to measure what is the right amount of controversy? Because at a certain point, the community gets big enough. I mean, full RBF and the data carrier, changes were not without controversy. There were still good changes, I think most people would agree, but they were super controversial. Should we not have done them? Were they not that obvious?
So I think a very interesting thing about those examples is it speaks to when you want to measure controversy, there's different ways of measuring it. And I would say, the data carrier controversy is a good example where the controversy among people who understand the tech was pretty low. Controversy among people who didn't was very high. And in an example like that type of controversy, I would go argue, because of how I'm happy to work and sort of what social environment I'm happy in, that didn't matter. I mean, I don't care how much Luke hates me. It just doesn't matter. It's just completely irrelevant to me. And in that respect, from my point of view, those are very uncontroversial things because I can just go put in Libre Relay and like it just magically happens and that's that. And they can argue all they want, but it just doesn't matter. So yeah, to me, that was extremely low controversy. Now, if I was to do a consensus change, I mean, let's just say hypothetical, like some kind of either tail emission or demurrage, I would expect that to be extremely controversial in a way that's unavoidable because I actually have to go and convince people who are not me to go do things. And that controversy is a very fundamental thing. Now, if you go back to, say, Ethereum, well, so much of why there's just not much controversy in something like Ethereum is it's just inherently very centralized. Very few people actually run Ethereum nodes that matter. When he gets chains like Solana, it gets even worse. I mean, crazy examples. I actually had, I think it was in Kiev or something. Someone at a conference told me that they had a budget of like $1 million, something like that, to run a genuine Solana node with full archival history. And they spent the money trying to achieve this for like a year, and then eventually just gave up and realized it is actually impossible to get the full history because people who have it won't give it to you. Now that's a type of system which has very low inherent controversy for consensus changes because so few people are actually involved. Bitcoin is not that.
So interesting anecdote, because you mentioned the people who were against the recent relay changes are the ones that didn't understand it. One of the things I found, frankly, very, very surprising when I was about 2 years ago going around advocating for CTV as part of L-Enhance was people who I considered experts in script and Lightning literally not understanding how CTV worked and how CTV plus check sig from stack was roughly equivalent to SigHash any prev out on your signatures. And so in that case as well, actually, the people that were pushing back were people that literally didn't understand what the things did. But that didn't take away the controversy.
Well, unfortunately, I think that's an example of you probably running into that in part because the things it enables just aren't desired enough for people to bother putting in the effort to truly understand this thing.
Right, but that applies to like do the things that are enabled by expanding the data carrier size, do they have that level of importance?
Let me put it to a better example, as Jeremy explained. Like when it was proposed that there were some design issues in Taproot, and that was pointed out to the people that did care about it, that did want to build on top of it. They were not aware of the issues that that were in that design.
Well, I'd say the issues potentially you have with Taproot are things that are minor issues around the periphery of what Taproot is. Now you can go make an argument, well maybe quantum stuff is going to change a bunch of things, but that's kind of a separate argument there. And that's, I don't think, is relevant to the discussion that was had as Taproot was coming. 32 bytes versus 33 bytes, that's an optimization thing, but it's not like really fundamental. Whereas
it does create the issue that you were talking about in the complexity of while it's implementing it.
Sure.
And there were a lot of bugs that were introduced, and people lost Bitcoin because they miscoded that change.
I
Again,
don't
it's
think
not the same as like a protocol level thing, but
it's a lesser degree of controversy. When you look at the fundamental design of it, of let's Merkleize script, that is something which is very easy to get around because it's very obvious. The exact details of how you Merkleize script, there's some controversy there, but it's a very different thing. I mean, I'll give a really extreme counterexample. It's a very different thing than something like drive chains, where the very idea of allowing miners to do things this way is fundamentally incredibly controversial.
So I think also for Taproot, one thing is that I agree that you can get lost in some of the minutia of it. And obviously, today if we had 33 bytes, a lot of things would be easier. But some of the controversy as well is just like really buried because there's a little bit of maybe monoculture. And I think one of the examples of this is that Taproot probably should have used BLS signatures. And the main reason is there's a pairing assumption, which is a new cryptographic assumption, which is bad for reasons. However, and it's a new curve because SecP doesn't support one. But the sort of weirdness of it is that it's also it's a little bit of a blame game issue as well, where if devs introduce a feature and it's somehow insecure, they really don't want it to be particularly their fault, and that's fine. Taproot, in a sense, is designed with a very high preference for if something breaks in your wallet stack, it's not the Bitcoin core dev's fault, it's your fault. And the level of that is basically that you end up with musig, which is incredibly complicated to get right. And you can say, oh, it's simple. Okay, we've gone through many iterations of musig that have had various bugs and vulnerabilities that have been relatively difficult to find. Maybe it's in a good place today, but it's not widely deployed. In BLS, all of the complexity of multisig aggregation is basically contained within the pairing assumption. And it's so easy to write the aggregation. A child could do it. Maybe one person in particular's child here, but it's really not that bad. And if there were a problem in it, it wouldn't be in the wallet author's code, but it would be in the pairing assumption, which the core devs maybe vetted. So there's maybe a little bit of conservatism in who gets the blame. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if your coins get stolen because there's a bug in your multisig. Code.
I got to point out though that when you go back to when Taproot was created, the academic understanding of Schnorr was that, oh yeah, this will be quite easy to go do that. And I would not be surprised if, let's say history had gone differently, it could have easily come out that these BLS signatures actually turned out to be way more difficult than we thought. In much the same way as that when people finally used Schnorr in production, which was really Bitcoiners, realized actually this is hard.
We knew that musig was going to be hard because there was no security proof of doing that yet.
I would not agree with you there. I'd say Schnorr, we believed based on the academic research at the time that this would be fine. And then academia itself found actually we screwed this up, and our understanding of Schnorr signatures just was incomplete.
Yeah, I mean,
and this is harder to do in these constructs than we expected.
I mean, I think it was at the time that this was being discussed, Bram, who is still around, really did die on the hill of you guys are being incredibly stupid for not just doing BLS signatures, and he said that basically as often as he could say it.
One thing that is worth mentioning here is that in both cases, you're pushing some complexity onto wallets because the wallets either have to now have the ability to generate keys on two different curves and sign on two different curves, or they have to deal with the complexity of implementing MuSig. I don't think there's an obvious win here, one way or the other. I do think it's worth emphasizing that in the implementation difficulties of MuSig, the final published specified version, MuSig 2, having implemented it in several languages, about 1/3 of that complexity comes from simply the choice of 32-byte keys. And that's where a lot of the errors in early implementations of MuSig happened, is dealing with the parity bit flipping back and forth in the right cases. So there's always trade-offs of where you push complexity and where you push costs. It's not free. BLS wouldn't have been a free win. It's just trade-offs.
I mean, at least I can go say, I think I may have even said this publicly, the whole bit of trying to reduce the keys by 1 byte, to me that seemed like this is stupid. In the same way as that Bec32, putting all that complexity just to have a slightly better checksum seems stupid to me. But, I'm a lazy engineer who doesn't like to go do work. I'd much rather just do something simple that works.
So I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. I think one of the things that has kind of become clear in this conversation so far is we all agreed that controversy is a good thing, and in the right doses, it allows things. You need sunlight to it's the best disinfectant type of idea, but the challenge is how do you measure it? What is the right amount of controversy? What is how do you evaluate in as objective a way as possible what is quality controversy versus what is just noise? And one of the serious challenges that we've seen come about, I think especially in recent years, with that difficulty is that controversy, while maybe good, can also impact the cost of development, especially in open source. And so we've seen people get kind of burnt out from having to deal with this, and so there's this inherent tension, I think, between having an open source kind of development ecosystem, but one that doesn't have kind of a centralized leader that can kind of Linux is a model that a lot of Bitcoiners think about, and yet it still has more of the centralized leadership that helps to keep these things under control. And so I guess the kind of last thing I want to kind of put to the panel here is how do you guys see this tension between free and open source software and the costs of controversy on that community and healthy development, and how can we maybe protect because I think Jeremy, it was a couple years ago, you were you had to take a break from Bitcoin as a result of some of the costs of this. So if you guys can talk about that tension and maybe how you see us as a community maybe able to deal with that, or maybe it's just acceptable.
I don't like this example of Linux because Bitcoin is a consensus system. It just has fundamentally different characteristics than basically everything else on the universe. To be clear, I'm not
using that as a comparison. Yeah. I think we look to that as an example of this open source protocol that a lot of people use. My point is basically is exactly that. You can't use that as an example because it is fundamentally different.
Well, and an interesting thing there is the way people actually use Linux in practice gets filtered through all these distributions that do so much more work on top of the kernel that Linus ultimately blesses. And that's just so different than the Bitcoin world. Now, the closest I think we have is probably Lightning, where you certainly can have different Lightning implementations that disagree about stuff, and it's fine. To various degrees of fine, depending on what exactly you're talking about. But a great example is you can have different, good examples like taproot channels. LND supports taproot channels between different LND instances. And you can route over taproot channels publicly because, if I'm at point A and, you're at point Z, everything in between, it doesn't really matter to you. It's the HTLCs is all that matters.
But that only works if the base layer is operating
correctly,
correctly, right? So
it works, hang on. So with Lightning, it's weird because you can route HTLCs over things that aren't even real. And that's a weird thing to wrap your head around. Now, you can make the arguments that you ultimately do need Bitcoin, and thus you need that kind of consensus. But you see how it's a weirdly separate thing?
Yeah, I mean, so the question is how do you deal with Lightning is not a good example. Linux is not a good example.
I think, we are our own community, so things will just be bespoke for us. The main thing maybe I would impart on this is that I think by and large over the next year or two we probably need to mostly abandon all of the online communications. I think that they're going into the.
That's impossible.
Well, if you'll give me a sec, it may be impossible, but at least in terms of quality of discourse, it's rapidly race to the bottom of the worst slop. And so I think in a previous generation we took as a strong cultural norm to make everything as strongly remote participation accessible as possible. And I think that was because you wanted to open the funnel as widely as possible for participation and be decentralized. And I think with the slop tools, it probably needs to
the what tools?
Slop tools, GPT and Claude and all friends. That probably it's a lot more important that somebody in person, live, can explain a concept and discuss and debate. And I think maybe this is something for the event organizers in the audience, but having either professional scribes or things at events to sort of note down what was discussed, what types of things were done. I think we'll just see a collapse of context and nuance in a way that almost nothing will be able to be nothing will be able to proactively be worked on when you could write something that's a good idea and then have 10,000 pages of support and 10,000 pages of against generated almost
the cost
instantly.
of disruption is rapidly falling, basically, right? You can disrupt, you can create alternative arguments and even implementations at way cheaper. So
yeah, and the quality bar just you need to raise the cost basically on proof of work for contribution.
An interesting analogy that I often think about is you have the French and the American Revolution that happened basically at the same time, and the American Revolution, especially when they were writing the Constitution, happened behind closed doors. No one was even allowed to take notes. There was a couple dedicated note takers, and then and eventually successful. There's a lot of debate still, a lot of controversy, the Federalist Papers, and then the French Revolution, in contrast, had everything out in the open, and they ended up chopping off tens of thousands of people's heads, and it feels like
Sounds
a good
Bitcoin.
Yeah,
I really can't agree with this because the online tools are already plenty good at making AI slop bot matter. I mean that's just not the relevant issue here. I'd say the bigger fundamental issue we're all running into is just the easy ideas are already taken. Now we're talking about much more niche things that just aren't that relevant. If you want to go push Bitcoin forward, the way you push Bitcoin forward is working on stuff like Lightning, which doesn't need much in the way of consensus changes or even any. I mean, look at the ARC guys who figured out all kinds of stuff they can do without any changes to Bitcoin. And that is a much more productive process going forward.
Maybe debatable. Brandon, do you want to talk about the developer burnout question or?
Sure. I mean, just briefly, another thing that's important here is kind of different than Jeremy's point. Just the changing from fully public discussions to semi-public. I've noticed in the last 5-ish years, my online time shifting from on X primarily to being in group chats and places like that, where it's not truly open entry, it's almost open entry. Because, the level of slopification on X and other public forums is just so high.
But I mean, that's not even how we did forks in the past. I remember the process being in the past, lots of private stuff. A lot of us, wouldn't necessarily know about this because they weren't there, but there's all kinds of private discussion on all this. And it always gets down to the nuance of what exactly are you trying to go change and how that process will be. Yeah, and if, hypothetically, there was something as simple as obvious as check lock time verify again, I suspect the same kind of approach would work just fine. But you run into the problem of what are the types of changes people want to make, and fundamentally the landscape's just different there.
I think it's just the gain function is basically gone from it being default things don't get amplified to default things get amplified, and I think that that means that when quality thinking is happening, it will be more in whispers than in shouts. And I think that that's like whatever mitigates that. I don't think that
this
it's
just
likely.
feels to me like someone butthurt that other people don't think their ideas are that quality.
I'm not even talking
Like-
about anything specific. I'm just saying, like, if you wanted to go, like, say anything, you're, like, getting a massive feedback loop of, like, AI slop right now, and that may or may not matter.
I just don't think that's that different from the sort of bullshit discussion we had around block size wars. I mean, we had the same kind of thing. It's just instead of AI, it was paid actors and, you know, just stupid people. And, like, that's not that different from AI. And again, the solution there is obvious.
AI is cheaper, right? So you do the same thing, so you can do it at greater
significantly
volume.
different.
No, nobody's arguing it is.
Well, because the tools that we have to combat that type of thing have always been really strong, which is to go have identities. And these identities, you go build them up by making good arguments, and that's just as true now as it was in the AI world. But what has changed is that the level of quality of the ideas people are pushing out and the level of impact has just fundamentally gone down because we've done all the easy stuff. Now we're doing harder things.
Sounds like we're measuring the easy stuff based off of lack of controversy, but when the community was a lot smaller, then therefore...
It's not about size. It's that we did easier things initially, and then Bitcoin got closer to perfection, and now getting the next level of things is just fundamentally harder because there's a lot more nuance in what exactly is better or worse and a lot less impact in it.
So how do you measure easy and obvious?
You go and look at, you know, how easy and obvious it is technically. Like, again, like check lock time verify is a great example. It's such a simple change that clearly made a lot of important things
so
better.
I've got a
and
good litmus
it's just,
test for you is op I key. So
Sorry, say
op
again?
internal key. Really easy, really obvious.
That's-
Big improvement for anyone.
it is just not as easy and obvious as something like check lock time verify. It's much harder to go
it's like
talk about.
Op I key is definitely easier than check lock time verify.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's not obvious the impact. That's the thing.
It directly impacts Lightning channels by saving them 8 virtual bytes in
And Taproot
forced poses.
was infinitely more complex than any of these as well.
Well,
But Taproot,
so-
the
so-
basic idea of you go Merkleize things was pretty damn obvious.
Right, but we didn't just do the
I think
Merkleize.
to
Sure,
engage
but I
with
mean,
Buck's
it's-
point
but-
is
No
like,
controversy, guys.
he's asking specifically how do you measure easy and obvious, and I'm giving you a specific compare numerically what makes op I key less, and you're just going, oh, it's just it's more
Well,
complicated.
look,
If you can
look,
actually quantify it,
we fundamentally-
because lines of code, it's fewer lines of code.
Well-
like impact, it's like a very clear impact.
All right.
It's not that clear.
There's not more than one way to implement it.
On that, let's ask if we want to let the audience, if you want to dig more into this particular question, you can, or if you want to ask something else.
I mean, should we start with the fifth panelist
Should be
here?
merged and out today if it's so easy and obvious. But I think maybe something else has changed.
All right, 6 panelists here.
Can you show me on the doll where internal key touched you, Peter?
I mean, I don't really care about it one way or the other. I'm just saying the impacts of it are just not as obvious as something boring. Like, yeah, all right, it would be good if transactions could be locked a certain time. Like, it's like
You could lock transactions to a certain time before you had to check lock time verify. You just have to put it in the pre-signed transaction. Like,
Yeah.
why?
Would you
It-
like
it
to
is
have
damn
more
clear there's certain things you
transactions
can't
per
do.
block? And would you like, for the same cost of bytes, and would you like to pay less for each one of them individually?
Look, there's all
This
kinds
sounds like
of
an
little,
attack on Bitcoin.
There's all kinds of little serialization changes you do that they're just not that interesting.
Yeah, well, because it's easy and obvious. It's not that interesting.
But we saved a byte. It cost us hundreds of lines of code.
Okay,
with those
no
stupid
one is
Taproot
allowed
keys.
to say something is interesting or not interesting for the rest of this panel. That word is banned.
That's an interesting rule.
Or is it a retarded?
It might be an
rule?
obvious rule.
All right, this is for each of you. So what's your most controversial opinion on Bitcoin Core specifically? And it like, don't like have any like restraint, just like say like, what is the most controversial thing you can think of?
Oh, I can think of something very easy, which is the current crop of maintainers are wimps. Like
I call them children.
I said this publicly when Gloria left. It's like if people get worried about this type of like so-called cyberbullying and all that, you know, you're just not in a position to be responsible for a major implementation of like $1 trillion thing.
Are you
like,
offering yourself up as a maintainer?
Who wants to pay me for it?
Chain code, maybe? What?
I mean, C++ is boring, and I don't really care about it. But yeah, hypothetically, someone gave me enough money, maybe I'd go and do it. But and I think part of the problem here is because we did all these interesting stuff first, maintaining Bitcoin Core is just getting less and less interesting. And it's harder to go get people willing to go do that kind of boring task. And then you wind up with people who just don't have the right mindset to be responsible for something that important.
So there's, I'll say something which is maybe not well known, but does dovetail with that. Is that there's two levels of original sin within the Bitcoin Core project. You can maybe go back further, but these are like the most recent two levels of sin. And the earlier one is that Wumpus was made the maintainer. Now, this is to say nothing of that. Generally, over the course of their tenure, Wumpus did a good job as lead maintainer. But I think one thing that I remember being stated at the time is that, while incredibly gifted technically, Wumpus was in no way the leader of the project, and that it was actually to draw attention away from other people who are really, in a different way, leading the project. But we can have somebody who's less controversial. So maybe that's less controversy in Bitcoin. Who everyone could agree, okay, well, this person can do the work technically, but other people are pushing the project in the direction. So you separated the concept of who's leading the project versus who's the lead maintainer of the project. And then the second sin that went on top of that is that when Wumpus retired, which I guess Wumpus is back, but not in the same role or capacity. An experiment with no permission from the community, basically, not that the core needs, but it's not just permission. It's not even really like notice that this was an experiment that was happening. Is Bitcoin became the maybe first and only open source project in history to not have any sort of lead maintainer. And there's no lead maintainer today. They're just maintainers. And while I'm not necessarily one to favor authorities. It's generally well known across lots of different consensus systems that you will almost surely make no progress without a leader of some sort or some process for having a leader. Even if you can fire the leader, not having a leader, no progress. And we're in a state for the last couple of years where there's no leader of core, and I think it shows for the quality of result. And whether or not you agree that this is a good idea, it is a separate thing from it's sort of like a unacknowledged experiment in project governance. And one rule that I try and say for people is, be really interesting in one specific way. Don't try and be interesting in two ways, because as soon as you go for the second way, you can get into a lot of trouble. And so if Bitcoin as a project is making the world's only decentralized, government-free money, that's really cool. That's really interesting. Okay, we don't also need to be the world's only leader-free open source project where there's no lead maintainer who can be fired setting the pace. So that double experiment for me is something that I think is completely nuts.
That really sounds like nonsense to me, because I am sure you could go find other examples of projects, especially like semi-abandonware stuff, that don't really
semi-abandonware stuff. You made the point.
That don't have a lead maintainer. And there's a lot of semi-abandoned open source software that people still use and works fine because you solve most of the problems. The other thing I'd go say is the idea Bitcoin Core's made no progress seems like nonsense. I mean, we've got Cluster Mempool, which clearly does all kinds of interesting stuff for niches. And that's
I think Buck did a whole talk about this topic a couple hours ago. I do want to answer your question, so I'll put a different take on the Bitcoin Core, what I can say controversial about them. I'll say that Nick Carter and his quantum fudsters are absolutely correct that there is a dereliction of duty among the Bitcoin core maintainership. It's just not about quantum. There's a failure of leadership. It's just not about that.
That's maybe an example of it too. It's because there's no leadership, it makes it that you can almost view that as an attack on Bitcoin by distracting the development activity. If you don't think it's an actual threat, if there's no leader, then it's easy to get sucked down into other topics that are maybe not as important.
I'll go on a limb here and say I think if the quantum guys could actually go show that quantum was a real thing and not a whole bunch of hype, we would suddenly find out that, assuming that there were reasonable quantum secure solutions that quickly get adopted.
Okay, so who in the audience would claim to be the foremost expert in this audience of Lightning? Somebody's got to do it. It's going to be probably one of you two. Okay. How does cluster mempool make your life better? And if you can just give us the.
Oh man, I'm not the right person to answer this because I have a beef to pick with cluster mempools. So that's
Okay,
not
so
exactly
very
fair.
interesting and obvious.
I
how
like
it helps you.
Sorry.
Totally worthwhile.
Sorry, what was the?
Well, I think that like the point is, Bitcoin Core is doing all these great things like cluster mempool. Okay, it's great. It's supposed to help, protocols for some reason. How is it helping you?
Issue that they made with the one parent, one child thing. So they got to, there's some stuff that they had hacked into Bitcoin to help Lightning that they got to clean up. So there was some like weird edges to the protocols that they got to clean up, but that. They had to hack that into Bitcoin Core. Their first one was in 2019, which they called the carve out. And then the carve out wasn't enough, so they came up with this thing called one parent, one child truck transactions. And that has its own really ugly edge cases. And I think my understanding is that cluster mempool improves that.
Sets the stage to improve that.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't like this.
And I want to be clear. I don't say cluster mempool is some radical thing that's going to change all Bitcoin. I'm just saying it's a clear example of progress. And to go say like Bitcoin Core does not make progress is nonsense.
It's a clear example of maintainership. I'm not positive it can be
Interesting and
defined as
obvious
progress.
example of progress.
I think we need beer for the rest of this.
So I think what I would contend is that if you did have like a leader of a project, not that I'm saying we have someone who I'd say, oh, this person should obviously lead core, is you might say like, okay, we're going to set a year goal to get the shipped. And I think with cluster mempool, it is a nice example of like a concerted effort among everyone to like, okay, we're going to really fix the problems that are facing the Lightning Network.
Done by the de facto leader that still exists in Bitcoin development.
Possibly, but it hasn't achieved that outcome because it's still asterisk.
Hang on, though. An important nuance here is that when you say the problems with Lightning Network, we got to be clear here that cluster mempool and these kinds of things fixes a sort of like a 5% issue. These are edge cases that affect Lightning in certain scenarios that aren't very common. Lightning, in the vast majority of cases, works fine with the current mempool policy. There's just edge cases where we think, oh yeah, this might be exploitable and so on. And this gets back to, we solved all the hard problems, the stuff that was easy to make a bunch of progress on. Now we have these edge cases that are left.
Look, channel factories.
We still don't have like L2 or things like that. There's like massive like state databases for Lightning.
Yeah, no channel
like,
factories,
none of these
no
things are
vaults.
clearly
We
that
have major
important.
things that aren't solved yet. You're saying we've solved all the important things, but there are major unsolved things that literally contribute to the fact that that almost all institutional Bitcoin is held at just 2 or 3 custodians, and that's partially because of the difficulty of building a custody solution, which is because of limitations of Bitcoin consensus. So it's simply not true to say that we already solved all the important things. We're just not doing important things anymore.
I really can't agree with you there. The hard parts about Bitcoin adoption right now are really thorny issues around like legality and tax law and all this. I mean, the U.S. going and charging fucking capital gains on Bitcoin transactions, that is a much more important issue than any technical thing.
¿Por qué no los dos?
CZ.
Sorry?
Why not both?
Look, I think when you compare one to the other,
Know the meme?
look, we're tech guys. We're not. We aren't that effective at working on this stuff, so we wind up working on our own thing. But when you look at the grand scheme of things, if you want Microsoft to go and be, using Lightning to like everyday people, I'd say that's a much bigger problem.
So I'll leave you a quote from actually from Wumpus, I believe. I could be wrong, but at one point I proposed, hey, everybody wants to use Bitcoin Core, wants to use Bitcoin Core Wallet. One of the problems, this is an email that I sent, I believe it should be on the mailing list somewhere, is everybody has a basis for their coin, and when you spend that coin, you have a tax exposure, and because you can't actually tax plan inside of Core, it makes the wallet almost unusable. So even though it's a local concern, like many places have these capital gains rules. If we could add to the wallet functionality, we could probably increase the number of people willing to do transactions if it was easy for them to know how much this transaction is going to cost them. And I believe the response was you should make that change through voting for different politicians who will repeal all your taxes, rather than like make core like more functional for users.
No, Wampus is right on that. I mean, that gets into political stuff because like ultimately the idea.
Wait, but you just said that the main thing that we're struggling with is political things. So we can't write any code that makes the political things easier.
But no, because that doesn't make it easier because it's agreeing to it.
It does too, because you could set, I don't want to pay more than X taxes on this transaction, so I'm
could
not
do
going to
coin
spend UTXO
selection
if the
with tax
taxes are too
awareness.
high. Right? Like that's actually a rule you could have in a wallet that would be useful.
Well, I mean, look, no. I mean, the
game goes to
reality
jail.
of laws is that if you have mass disobedience, the laws get changed. I mean, look at Uber.
But if you can't get that adoption because of that lack of functionality, then you also can't.
Which gets
get the
back to
mass
we're much
disobedience.
better off with people getting jurisdictions taking these limitations away. And look,
It also solves the controversy problem because if fewer people are using Bitcoin, we'll have much less controversy.
a bit of accounting software isn't going to change
You just
really big
said
business problems.
you just said
But
the
Peter,
reason that
Peter.
people aren't using Bitcoin is because it's hard to pay taxes. And then you said but the real thing is that people just shouldn't pay taxes.
We got 3.5 minutes
Look,
left.
You
the
are all
difficulty is
retarded.
fundamental here.
Everyone on stage, you are all
We can
retarded.
all agree.
Says the man in
We
the
can all
pink
agree
hat.
that we're all retarded. We have time for one more question. Anybody have a question?
I don't know if this is too big for a last question, but it does strike me that you guys just mentioned about the fact that the quantum thing is the identification of the right root problem, but the wrong kind of surface or branch issue, right? Like the problem there is also, it strikes me quite similar to the knots versus core debate, where like client diversity is actually the root issue, and I think we should all probably be in favor of more client diversity, but the construction of the debate in public is radically malformed compared to like the actual underlying issue. I'd be curious what your guys' thoughts are about the fact that we seem to be, at least in this generation of Bitcoiners, afflicted by the inability to have constructive conversations about the actual root issues versus getting drawn into these, kind of what I would call navel gazing or superficial sort of, low information debates about things that are actually irrelevant or meaningless. Like, what is the cause of that, or like how do we overcome that, or like how badly are we being wounded as a community by being unable to come up over the top of this issue?
Well, I think we have two problems, and one is that we're all retarded, and the other is that we're all autistic. And in that situation, it is very hard to not get sucked into rabbit holes and bike sheds.
I think that what I would say is we're in a very inspiring venue. We're at the, are you done? Okay. I don't know what the laughing was for. So we're in an inspiring venue, the Hoover Dam, which is like a massive engineering project. Maybe it's the wrong thing because I'm looking at the water levels, but it's a massive, inspiring infrastructure project. And a lot of these things take someone being like, okay, we're going to build this, and we're going to solve for this problem, and we're going to do this with a concerted effort. And then after we finish that, we'll do the next thing. And the next thing, and the next thing. And I think as a society of Bitcoiners, which is what we're doing, is I think dedicated directional problem solving is probably the way that things move forward, because you want to put the things that are going to kill Bitcoin in the rear view mirror, not leave them in front of you for avoiding them at some point later. It's just put more reasons to die in your rear view mirror and move on. It would be sort of, I think, part of this gap that you're noticing of like, okay, well, why is it that we've had proposals for solving quantum on Bitcoin for 5 or 6 years now and nothing's tangible? That would be, okay, we need a culture of putting problems in the rearview mirror.
I mean, I can give you a very easy answer, which is like all of the solutions quantum suck. Now, let's say hypothetically someone came up with something, used as many bytes of signature, computed as fast, et cetera, as say Schnorr, and it was quantum safe. It'd be much easier to get the stuff involved. But all of the quantum secure stuff we have is massive trade-offs. And those massive trade-offs mean that in the face of very real and very genuine uncertainty of whether quantum computers will ever actually be real, the obvious answer is, well, let's go and wait later. Now, going back to client diversity, of course, if people actually have pilot client diversity, all this stuff becomes harder because now you have a zillion subtly incompatible different things. All these solutions are actually easier if you have less client diversity. And that's the only way, consensus software is ever going to work right now. And, the Hoover Dam is a great example of this. We look at this thing and think, oh man, that's so complex. It's such an amazing engineering achievement. No, Hoover Dam is way simpler than Bitcoin Core. Way simpler.
I don't know if I was asked, because I'm technically the moderator, but I would say I think there's 3 circumstances under which like big risky changes are undertaken. One, if there's basically no risk, so when the project is much smaller, not worth trillions of dollars. 2 is if there's an emergency, and so you kind of like have to rush to do something, and it like forces everybody into action. You often make bad decisions that way too. And then the third is if there's like financial motivation. So like companies are willing to take on big risks because they're either going to like go out of business, or they're like want to like take a big risk to make a lot of money. Like Nvidia is a recent example of this. Some of the risks that they took in terms of investments in AI chips. And I think the problem is like Bitcoin is worth a lot of money now, so the financial motivation to like solve the next problem is not as high. The risks are really high, so we don't even want to try and get activation clients in place, not let alone like actually activate them. So the risk is just like, well, I don't want to touch that, put that onto the wallet. And then we will do something in the next emergency, and like this is like ultimately how SegWit got activated, and we might make a mistake in that, and so that's it's purely subjective. I don't know if it's right or wrong.
SegWit wasn't an emergency though.
I agree, but people perceived it as an emergency when like okay, well the ecosystem was kind of losing its mind at that point in time, and fees got up to like $100, and so people were like, well, we got to solve the block size. It was a manufactured emergency, but that's often how.
Right, and that's a really important thing. People knew it was a manufactured emergency.
Not everybody did. Yeah, but
among my side, we knew it was manufactured.
Yeah, I believe you. But again, this is how like that's one way things can get co-opted. Is you can manufacture controversy to kind of like get an issue through in place. So it's like, oh, maybe somebody will forge proof of quantum computers to get something in place that they actually have some backdoor to or something. It's like a totally manufactured example. And with that,
Totally manufactured.
With that, thank you everybody. Thank you to the panelists and everybody indulging us. This was a lot of fun.